This is the second video talk to go alongside the Bible reading programme which the King's Church is about to launch. And in this talk we're going to go between the covers to consider the content of the Bible. The first thing we notice just by looking at the contents page is that the Bible is split into two parts, one about 3 times the size of the other. We call the larger part the Old Testament and the smaller the New Testament. These descriptions are not original to the text in any sense. It seems the first recorded use of either of these terms didn't occur until the late 2nd century AD. And of course the New Testament itself simply refers to the previous scriptures as just scripture, not the Old Testament. But somehow these two terms have stuck and now appear not only in the contents page but also within the main Bible itself on 2 separate pages of their own, Old Testament on one, New Testament on the other. This effectively creates a division and is bound to affect how we see the Bible and hence read it. Incidentally, I've been known to tear out these 2 separate pages from my Bible just to show, one, that it doesn't fall apart as a result, and secondly, I'm not instantly struck down. It therefore seems to me it wasn't God who put them there, and nor does he care too much about them. However, these 2 descriptions do raise important questions and create big challenges which must be faced in any Bible reading programme. So the first issue to come to terms with when reading through the whole Bible is that it actually consists of 2 separate canons or collections of scriptures, not just one. The first part of our Bible is precisely the same as the Jewish canon, at least in terms of content. There are some differences in other ways which we'll consider later. So it seems that most of our Bible isn't Christian at all. Over 3/4 of it, 77%, belongs to another religion, Judaism. So why should we bother with that? Why are we still carrying it around as part of our Bible? It only makes it much heavier, as well as more complicated and demanding to read. But it's easy to see why some Christians consider this to be the least relevant part of the Bible, and so just restrict themselves to a few favourite passages and leave the rest of it. But actually it soon becomes clear why the Jewish scriptures should be part of our Bible and should continue to be read by Christians. For Jesus and his disciples, this was 100% of their Bible. Jesus learnt it as a boy and quoted from it extensively, whether when he was being tempted in the wilderness, teaching the crowds in Galilee, or the religious leaders in Jerusalem, or even when dying on the cross. According to those who count such things, Jesus referred in total to 20 Old Testament characters and quoted from 19 Old Testament books. He also said he hadn't come to set aside or destroy what had been written beforehand. This was not a throw it all away and start again plan. And of course this Old Testament was also the only set of scriptures that the early church had. It was regularly read and used in their teaching and preaching and referred to constantly within their own writings. Again, according to those who'd like to produce statistics, 17 books in the New Testament contain around 364 quotations from 25 different Old Testament books. I haven't personally checked that out, but it's clear that all the Gospel writers make extensive use of the Old Testament, as indeed does Paul. For instance, his letter to the Romans contains around 70 references to the Old Testament, more than any other book. The book of Hebrews has 41 references, and although the book of Revelation has few quotations, it does contain over 400 allusions or hints to the Jewish scriptures, relying heavily on the imagery of certain other books, such as Daniel, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. So clearly knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures is essential when reading the New Testament. Now, tearing out those 2 pages containing the words Old Testament and New Testament, or just simply ignoring them, doesn't mean disregarding completely the significant differences between these 2 sections of the Bible. The problem really lies with the words used. There's something inherently suggestive about old and new. Old implies obsolete, outdated, even replaced. New is always better. And then what does testament mean? Well, it's usually defined as equivalent to covenant. So does the Bible contain only 2 covenants? One old, no longer needed, and one new, meaning for now. Well, we shall look at this important idea of covenant in the next talk, But here we note that the Bible contains several covenants, at least 5, and the issue with thinking there's only 2 is that it affects how we read the whole Bible, which then gets defined in overly simplistic terms, such as old equals law, new equals grace. And that's a common mistake, as there's plenty of both law and grace in each of the Testaments. So it's important for us as Bible readers to recognise both contrast and continuity between the 2 Testaments. There's continuity because it's the same God all through. The same nature, the same character, the same will. He is the central character of the whole Bible. His love, faithfulness and purposes remain steadfast throughout all the books. The contrast is due to this same God initiating a new covenant. And as a result, more scripture was needed, more revelation was needed to help us understand what God had now done. And so much of the New Testament was written to provide this extra revelation, and not to discard or replace the scriptures formerly given by God to the Jewish people. One obvious point of difference between the 2 Testaments is the change in language, from Hebrew plus some Aramaic to Greek. And then there's also a large time gap between the 2 of them, a gap of about 400 years. And this gap can sometimes lead people to focus on the discontinuity, as though here is a new start-up. We can leave the old behind, it was just a forerunner to something else. Well, to them, I think a warning should be given: mind the gap. Many a good Bible teacher has fallen down in that gap. The skill is knowing how to bridge that gap and make the right connections. To this end, both Testaments should be read on their own terms. Otherwise, there's a tendency to Christianise or spiritualise the Old Testament, which can distort its original meaning. So what does reading the Old Testament on its own terms really mean? Well, for a start, the Jewish people obviously didn't use the expression Old Testament to describe their scriptures. Instead, they spoke of them as the law, the prophets and the writings, which eventually became known by an abbreviation, Tanakh, which is an acronym based upon the words Torah for law, Nevi'im for prophets and Ketuvim for writings. But basically we should think of it as the law, the prophets and the writings. And you'll come across this phrase, or something similar to it, regularly when reading the New Testament. Sometimes it's just shortened to the law and the prophets, while still meaning the whole canon of Scripture, the Jewish Scriptures. As examples, Jesus said in one place, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets," meaning all of the Scriptures. That's in Matthew 5. In Matthew 7, he talks of summing up the law and the prophets, and in another that all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. That's of loving God and loving your neighbour. That's in Matthew 22. So the phrase the law and the prophets is used regularly to describe the Jewish scriptures. And at the end of Luke, it's in chapter 24, we find the phrase the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms, where the Psalms is used to refer to the writings, as it is the largest and most prominent book in that section. The point of all this for us as Bible readers is that we might need to adjust our thinking. What we usually think of as the Old Testament actually contains 3 distinct categories. The first part of our Bible is itself in 3 parts. This means that for any book of the Old Testament, we really need to know which category it's in and what its role is within that category. Well, we'll discuss this sort of thing more on a book-by-book basis in other talks. But for now we need to understand a bit more about these basic categories and how the Jewish people thought of them. For a start, they did not regard all 3 categories as being equal. The most important was Torah, which was learnt by heart and read regularly in the synagogue. The Torah is the same as the first 5 books of our Old Testament, often called the Pentateuch or the books of Moses. We think of these as being books of the law, but again we need to adjust our thinking. Certainly the Torah contains laws, many of them, but the word itself means much more. To simply equate Torah with law is misleading, as it makes us think of a legal system. Instead, the basis of the word Torah is just teaching, and refers to any kind of guidance, direction or instruction. It's about setting someone on the right path or pointing someone in the right direction, showing them the way ahead. It's not surprising, therefore, that this word Torah is also used for any part of Scripture which does this, and not just the first 5 books. Ultimately, all Scripture is Torah in that sense. Moreover, although there are many laws within the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there's a lot of narrative too. Narrative or story form also acts as Torah by teaching us indirectly through the lives of others. By drawing us into the life stories of many different people, good and bad, we see why the laws are correct. The validity of these laws is reinforced. We see their truth at work in real life, which is why over 40% of the Old Testament, and indeed much of the Bible in general, is in narrative form. We learn so much that way through stories. So how should we approach reading the first 5 books of the Old Testament? Well, basically, to learn about God. Well, that can be said of the whole Bible anyway. But also to learn from those books how to please him and how to be different from the world around us. In short, to find out what it means to be chosen and called as the people of God. After these 5 books, the Torah, comes what we think of as history books. Joshua, Judges, and on into Samuel and Kings. Once more, our thinking needs adjusting. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there are no history books as such. Remember, they call them law, prophets, writings. And these books, that's Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings, occur in the second category called the prophets. And in particular, they're known as the former prophets. They contain what's known as prophetic history, where here prophetic doesn't mean predicting the future, but giving us lessons from history. In particular, how the relationship between God and man worked out, or didn't, in the national life of Israel. Events are selected and written about to show God's purposes among his people. What did God require of them? How did they respond? What were the consequences of their obedience or disobedience? And that's how we should read these books too, not just as the history of another people, but as the story of God in our world. Incidentally, in the Jewish scriptures, Samuel and Kings are 1 book each, not 2. They were most likely split into 2 as they were too long for one scroll, rather than for any other significant reason. So we can, and indeed should, read them as though they were still 1 book each. So this means that the former prophets consists of just 4 books: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. The remaining prophetic books, or books in the prophets section, are called the latter prophets or the writing prophets. And also in the Jewish scriptures there's just 4 of these: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12, which is the way of describing all the other smaller prophets put together. So they're all there, but just collected together to form this 4th book called the 12. We often use the term major prophets for the first 3 and minor prophets for the rest, and that's simply based upon length, not importance. Incidentally, you may notice that Daniel is not included in this section at all. He's found in the 3rd section, the writings. In general, prophets are not to be regarded as fortune tellers or predictors of the future. They're best thought of as covenant enforcers, reminding people constantly of God's covenants with them and their obligations. So when reading a prophetic book, yes, you can look for promises and predictions, but read them as though they're teaching us how to live now. Now, from this point on in the Bible, we meet a lot of poetry. The prophets often spoke or wrote in this style. You'll see it set out differently, with jagged edges rather than straight lines, usually in the text. But Hebrew poetry is not like English poetry. It has its own distinctive features and peculiarities, where each couplet aims to develop a thought or a meaning, and this can occur in different ways. So in each couplet you might find that the second line simply echoes or reinforces the first line, and the link word there is usually and. Sometimes, though, the second line contrasts the first line, with the link word being but. And then, less commonly, the second line can develop the thought of the first line and take it a step further. And this can be linked with the word for, or it can also use the word and at that point. Needless to say that poetry has to be read differently from prose, and getting used to it is important. But we'll say more about Hebrew poetry when we look at certain books that are in that style. Let's come to the third section of the law, the prophets and the writings. And the writings themselves contain 11 books and basically collects together everything else. The main book here is Psalms. Others include the wisdom books of Proverbs, Job and Ecclesiastes, as well as those read at certain feasts, such as Ruth, Song of Songs, Lamentations and Esther. Daniel is also included here, as is Ezra and Nehemiah, also regarded as a single book, and Chronicles, which is actually placed last in the Hebrew Bible. Again, Chronicles is not regarded as a history book, in fact not even as prophetic history or a former prophet. We'll say more about all these books when they come up in the Bible reading programme, but sufficient to say for now is that Chronicles is not an exact repeat of Samuel and Kings, but is written much later and offers a slightly different perspective on their history. In general, the books in the writings section were seen as less important than the law and the prophets, but still sufficiently inspired to be part of the canon. Although it wasn't until the 1st century AD that everything in the Jewish canon was totally agreed upon. You may like to know that Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs were the last two books to be accepted in the Jewish canon. That's just in case you find them rather difficult yourself. Now, you may have worked out, if you've been doing some sums as we've gone along, that the total in the Jewish scriptures is just 24 books, 5 in the Torah, 8 in the prophets, and 11 in the writings. And yet they're identical to the 39 books in our Old Testament. That's why I said we have the same content, but they've been distributed rather differently. We now have them in a different order. I wonder why this is. Well, it seems that it goes back to the 3rd century BC, when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. This became known as the Septuagint. That's the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. And it's at that point that the books were split up to make 39, and the current structure of our Old Testament was formed. The point really is that although the whole Jewish canon was imported into our Bibles, we did lose something in the process, including the original categories of the law and the prophets and the writings, perhaps to our detriment, and we need to think about these again when we're approaching reading the whole of the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament it's all much easier. The categories are simpler. There are just 2 groups, Gospels and Letters, and 2 isolated books, Acts and Revelation. But what exactly is a Gospel? Well, we wouldn't know if we didn't have one, because it wasn't an existing format or genre taken up and used to tell the story of Jesus. They're not biographies as we think of this today. Rather, they are portraits of Jesus, individual impressions from the perspective of 4 different people. 3 of them are similar, Matthew, Mark and Luke, as they shared material with each other or from common sources. And then there's one, John, that's very different and read and written much later. Some people have tried to harmonise them into a single account. Well, this may be okay for the purposes of study, but when it comes to simply reading them, it's best to see them as 4 different accounts, all equally valid. One of the Gospel writers, Luke, never met Jesus, but he did join Paul at some point in his missionary journeys, and he wrote about this in a book we call Acts. That's the closest we get in the New Testament to a history book. Perhaps we should think of this as prophetic history. Luke also added a Gospel as a sort of prequel to this, so these 2 books should be read together. And it's interesting to see how Luke joins the 2 books together like 2 acts in the same drama. Letters can be awkward to read. It's like hearing only one side of a conversation. You should try and read the smaller ones all in one sitting. And they were often written to solve problems in the churches and usually contain a mix of doctrine and practical advice. Some of Paul's letters seem hot off the press. You can imagine him preaching them out loud. Well then do so. Imagine he's preaching out loud to you. The book of Revelation is a one-off. It falls into a special category of literature called apocalyptic, which basically describes the battle between good and evil and God's ultimate victory. This book is tough to read in places, but it's unique in that it was given directly by the risen Jesus to the Apostle John. It's also later than the other New Testament books, so neither the other apostles nor the early church believers heard this special revelation. But we needn't miss out. Well, in the final talk to this introduction to the Bible reading programme, we're going to offer some tips for those who have already read the Bible many times and are looking for something new to stimulate them to read it through once more.